Hi, I'm Ellen MacArthur. I left my career of sailing solo non-stop around the world, breaking records, to create the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, a charity which has the goal of inspiring a generation to rethink, redesign and build a positive future. I first sailed when I was 4 years old, and I'll never forget that first experience. I sailed on the southeast coast with my Auntie Thea, and seeing the boat for me on a mooring just out on the water was really exciting. But to climb on board for the first time, to see inside this tiny boat and see a little home, and then realise when we hoisted the sails for the first time that that boat could take us anywhere in the world, that to me was amazing. It was the greatest sense of freedom I think any child could feel, and I was hooked. For me, the goal was to sail around the world. I don't know why. It was just the ultimate, really. When you love sailing, you want to be at sea for as much as possible. And for me, the thought of sailing around the world was this goal. And from a small child, that was where I wanted to go. And I didn't know how I'd do it. I didn't know if I'd cruise. I didn't know if I'd find sponsorship. I was 17 years old. I was ill in bed with glandular fever. And I watched this programme. I borrowed my nan's video recorder to watch this programme about a race called the Whitbread Round the World. And these people on this boat were sailing around the world. They were racing around the world, but they were doing it with sponsorship. And I suddenly realised that's exactly what I was going to go and do. The journey to finding a sponsor and the journey to sailing around the world is huge, and there are so many different steps within it. In fact, it's probably harder to find the funding and build a boat than it is to actually sail around the world. But for me, one thing was key, and that was knowing where I was going. You know, from the age of 4, I wanted to sail around the world, and then everything else was a piece of the jigsaw that fitted into place. So no one's journey to getting to that place is the same. But for me, the realisation that it could happen was when I sat in a meeting with my sponsors, and I talked to the CEO for the first time, and I told him about that dream. And getting there was the hardest thing. Getting in that room, getting in that position where you can actually talk about what you dream of doing, that's the key. And they went with it. And they took a huge risk. I was a 22-year-old girl from Derbyshire who had no track record other than 17th in a transatlantic race. But they believed in me, and it paid off. And that partnership was fantastic. It allowed me to sail around the world twice solo, once in a race, once as a record, and it was the most incredible journey. It was amazing. For me, the realisation that there was something else out there came at the end of the Round the World. Never in my life did I ever think I'd give up competitive sailing. I didn't want to, I wasn't ready to, and I miss it hugely even today. But when I sailed around the world, I took with me a minimum of resources because the boat had to be light, and I managed them so carefully. I was so aware what I had, and I was so aware that I couldn't just stop and buy more. You're 2,500 miles away from the nearest shop. If you run out of food, there is no more. And I realised as a result of managing those resources so carefully on the boat, despite how tired I was, I realised what the definition of the word finite meant, because I knew what it was like to have no more. And I'd never compared that to a life on land. They'd been entirely separate for me. And at the finish of that last round the world, I began to question, was our world any different? And the more I questioned, the more I learnt, and the more I learnt, the more I realised that this challenge, our futures, making our futures work, was much greater than the challenge of sailing around the world. And with that, I decided to give up competitive sailing for this much greater challenge, and I have absolutely no regrets.